Students of Reddit, what was the biggest teacher meltdown you ever witnessed? In high school, they would do trivia questions after the announcement sometimes, and the first teacher who dialed the office with the correct answer would get a prize for the class. My math teacher really wanted to win, and hadn't yet this year. So one fateful morning, the question goes out, and we had the answer, so he called it in, but we were the second caller. In a fit of pseudo rage, he yells "damn it" and kicks this little plastic trash can across the room, where it bonks a kid right in the head. His eyes go wide, and he apologizes and asks if the kid is okay, which he is. Everyone got a good laugh afterwards, including the kid who got hit, and later, we would pretend to duck whenever we didn't win the morning trivia contests. I had a history teacher in high school who was always stern and serious, which was great, since it gave a reverence to what he was teaching about, and his unpretentious nature meant he spoke about what was important/interesting. One day however his voice broke, and after he cleared his throat it broke again. He stopped talking, put his hands in his pockets, frowned, and took a few breaths. "Students, sorry about this lecture, my wife and I just decided to get a divorce." He blankly stared ahead for a second, and then walked toward the door, loosening his tie. "I need a drink." He exited the door. After a second he poked his head back in. Of water. Him coming back. "Don't think I've forgotten about Napoleon." Not too much of a meltdown, but he was a pretty manly dude in a nerdy sort of way. Not so much a breakdown, but a break in normal behavior for sure. Our freshman English teacher was a small soft-spoken woman who was kind of known to be a teacher you could walk all over with little, but not no repercussions. We were in a review session after school and some upperclassmen were just hanging out in the hallways making lots of noise, so she was constantly poking her head out in the hall asking them to be quiet. As we are all very silent reading or something, the classroom door absolutely slams shut. So hard the latch didn't have time to catch, and the door bounced back up. The teacher immediately yells "oh hell no," kicks off her heels and takes off out the door. She caught up with the kid, who had taken a running start, and kicked the door shut and berated him for a good 10 minutes, which we could hear clear as day from the end of the hall. It was like nothing we'd ever heard from her. My 8th grade LA teacher cussed a kid out for spilling his juice. "Every fucking day you do this shit. Can you please clean up my floor? My fucking god. Your parents didn't teach you to clean up after yourself. What the fuck? Stop making me your personal cleanup crew." That was followed by a thrown roll of paper towels and a bloody nose. Apparently she found out her sister had died under the knife that morning. I was in band. One day, one of the regular always in trouble/disruptive students was being extra disruptive, while the director was trying to tell us something important. So after about 5 different times of going the normal route to get him to settle down, he cracked. It got quiet, and then the director bellowed student's name. "Are you stupid, or just don't give a shit?" The whole room was quiet. All eyes were now on the disruptive kid, who was then trying to hide behind his tuba. Then, the director continued with his announcement like nothing happened. We had an art teacher in year 7, 11 years old, who would lock himself in the supply cupboards and scream and rip his hair out. It was unsettling. I had a history teacher in HS. For context, this was in about 1980. To this day, I can't quite recall what prompted this, but he stood in front of the entire class, shaking with rage, and said, "I'm a homosexual." We were all just dumbfounded. Not that he was gay, I think most of us had figured that out already, but that he felt obligated to make that announcement. My super dorky history teacher in 8th grade was the nicest teacher I've ever met, but there were a couple class clowns in our class and he usually dealt with them okay. One day though, they were obnoxious the entire class from the moment he walked in, and he snapped, yelling and chucking his stapler across the room. He nailed a staple right into Ben Franklin's forehead. He immediately apologized and went about his day normally, while all the students went silent. Nobody ever bothered him again after that day. I had a Spanish teacher in middle school that was so tired of us turning in broken Spanish on our homework assignments that she screamed at us and called us stupid Americans before throwing pieces of chalk at us one after the other. Another time she got on her knees and started praying the rosary in front of us when a girl said "El Palo Nugget." Maybe not a meltdown per se, but I had a chemistry class that was held in a huge auditorium with really steep stairs. The professor always walked all around the room while we took quizzes and tests. One day he tripped halfway up the auditorium stairs and took a hell of a fall. He landed face down, unhurt apart from bruises, on the floor, and before we could really react he starts banging his fists on the floor and screaming, "Entropy, entropy, entropy." Junior year of high school I decided to take a psychology class. The administration switched a lot of teachers around that year and hired a lot of new ones too, so I didn't know anything about him. As the semester goes on, his behavior starts slipping and the class starts noticing. He begins to lose his patience more and more frequently when the class doesn't respond to a question immediately. His behavior then progressed to him throwing whiteboard markers at students for not paying attention or answering incorrectly. Then one day about one half the way into the semester he completely loses it. A group of 3 students laughed at something within their own conversation just as class was starting, and our teacher saw and made a comment to the class that if we weren't going to listen, he would make today hell. Some kid spoke up saying he would go to the principal if he did anything to hurt the class, so the teacher began throwing markers, erasers, anything he could find at the student. The student got up to leave for the principal's and the teacher stood up on his desk and screamed at us. He ran to the front of the classroom where the student who spoke out was, picked up a desk and threw it at the student. Thankfully it didn't hit him, but the teacher entered the door to prevent anyone from leaving and said if anyone told anything about that day to anyone, he would ruin our lives. Some friends and I told the principal and administration and I actually had to go into court to testify. Turns out the guy suffers from schizophrenia as well as some degree of PTSD after serving in the military. I don't remember what ended up happening with him. At the time I really didn't care to know. Year 9 maths class. Our teacher was off sick and her early 20s substitute teacher came in to cover. She was lovely, kind, friendly, although a bit timid and shy. One girl in our class used a fountain pen to flick ink on a skirt she was wearing one day. Poor woman noticed her do it, didn't say a word and just went to her desk, put her head in her hands and sobs. Doesn't move to 10 minutes at least. Eventually a friend of mine goes to get another teacher. The sub was escorted out, still crying, and was seen for the rest of the day just crying in her car. Didn't move for another 4 or so hours. 8th grade math teacher. He was well known for his short temper, but this particular day was bad. There was a kid in my class, Justin, that never listened and never did his homework. One day, math teacher just had it with Justin. Grabbed his desk with him in it and picked it up and slammed it back down on the ground a few times. After that, he shoved the desk with Justin in it across the room. Justin was fine, thankfully. Math teacher just stormed out. Told my mom and I guess a few other parents called the school about it too. He was gone for a few weeks and had to take anger management classes. I just went by my old middle school a few weeks ago and has the assistant principal now. Who would have expected that? I don't know if it really counts, but our former Latin teacher once slapped a kid across the face because the kid made fun of her dead husband. She got suspended shortly afterwards. Edit: the teacher got suspended, not the student. In high school, I turned in a form to my science teacher a day late. She screamed at me, walked out the classroom, and was gone for nearly an hour. Class had started and everyone had speculations, blaming me for what happened. Teacher comes back, joyful and smiling, says she just needed a walk around the campus to recover. In elementary school, the cool thing to do was put hand sanitizer in excess on your hand and sniff it pretending to get really high. Things escalated to the point of our teacher, at full volume, yelling where it's the hand sanitizer. A brave soul returned it, and the teacher threw it against the wall. When I was in elementary school, we used to have to line up in the hallways and a teacher would put hand sanitizer into our hands before we ate lunch. One time I turned around to this really douchy kid that was bullying me and clapped my hands as hard as I could right in front of his face and the hand sanitizer splashed into his eyes. Shortly after that the school decided to stop doing the whole hand sanitizer thing. Your story reminded me of that. I taught public high school for 7 years and have been teaching in a university ever since. Every time one of these threads pops up, I expect to find the story of how I once broke down in tears when a cell phone rang in class, or the time I threw up in a trash can, brushed my teeth with bottled water right in front of all 42 of them, asked a janitor to come down and take the trash out, and went back to teaching after my favorite student of all time faked barfing noises because he knew it would make me puke. My junior year in nursing school, we took a nursing psych class. The professor was not a good teacher, to put it lightly. She regularly would talk about her personal life instead of teaching what was outlined on the syllabus. About halfway through the course we had our midterm exam, which was consisted of about 75% of questions of stuff we had not covered in class. I think the highest grade anyone got was 65%. The next class she berated us and told us all we were going to be bad nurses. One of the people in my class wrote a letter to her saying that she spends most of the classes not teaching the material, and it is not justifiable to give us exams if we know more about her personal life than what we are supposed to be taught, citing the syllabus given to us at the beginning of the semester. All of us in the course signed the letter. Next class she absolutely lost it on us, screaming at us about how disrespectful we are and how we will never amount to nothing. This got the point that the dean of the nursing program heard her from down the hall and had to come remove her from the classroom. Next class we had another professor for the rest of the semester. The dean told us she was on hiatus and said that we brought up our grievances in a respectful manner and commended us on that. The professor who broke down never came back to teach at the school. We had an art teacher who had one glass eye, a student who had a rep for being an asshole from a whole family of assholes. His sister beat me up in infant school, unwisely decided to stick his head around the door to the art room and yell, in a voice that could shatter glass eye, "Harris, you one-eye jack." This did no go down at all well with Mr. Harris, who terrified most kids. Cue manic Welsh art teacher chasing student over the playing fields with a tent spike. The whole class was looking out the window following the chase. All it needed was yakety sax playing as a soundtrack. In my elementary school, there was this one super obnoxious kid named Lance who was constantly goofing off and all of that, though in all honesty, he probably had ADHD without a good support system. Most of our teachers were used to dealing with him, but one day we had this substitute named Mrs. Blake, who had no idea what to do with him and all of our class. He is mouthing off every other moment and jumping around like crazy when she starts to boil over and yells at Lance to sit down, which he does. He then calls her a beach or something under his breath, and she finished her transformation into a boiling tomato. She yells, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" which blew our little elementary school minds, and then very violently shook his desk. The thing was, Lance had a blood condition that made him bruise very easily and very dramatically. When she shook his desk, he started crying understandably because he was getting these massive purple black bruises all over his legs. She was banned from our school after that. I had a 10th grade history teacher who was very much pregnant at the time. We all walked into class one day and she was slumped over her desk sobbing. Since we were all awkward teenagers and nobody particularly liked this teacher to begin with, we all lay there awkwardly for a good 15 minutes in silence while she tried to pull herself together. For the remainder of the period she forced us to play baby shower games. I went to school in Germany, and once, when we had our history class, the lesson started off really weird. The teacher started dictating to us a math problem, in which you had to calculate what the costs are for treating disabled people, and how much the state could save if there weren't any disabled people. Most of us immediately realized that this was one of the propaganda math problems students in the Third Reich had to solve. We were kind of confused, since the Third Reich was not the topic which we were discussing at this moment. Nevertheless, we wrote down the problem and even started calculating, when the teacher suddenly snapped. He began to scream at the whole class with an intensity I have not witnessed before, about how we as the students should have rejected solving a task like that one. How we were educated to question everything, but still obeyed when he gave us a task which discriminated against disabled people. He was as furious that he left the classroom and only returned after half an hour. We spent the rest of the class talking about the dangers that a new movement like the Nazis could arise again in Germany, and how we always need to be aware of that. 10th grade was in math class and the teacher was getting frustrated that not everyone was understanding a problem, and he made various threats on what he would do if we didn't figure it out, more homework tests etc. I kept asking questions because I legitimately didn't understand, and he yelled fuck's sake and threw an eraser at me. I got up and left. Never ratted him out, and next day he was super patient with everyone. It was his oh I fricked up moment. I got beaten up by a tiny art teacher guy. I used to be an asshole in class and once called him short or something, and he asked me to see him after class. He told me that he had boxing gloves in his car and said he would like to have a quick go with me in the basement of the school. I laughed at first, but he said he was serious, and if I decided not to then I should stop talking shoot. I agreed and he got a couple pairs of gloves and beat the shoot out of me. Not like bloodied and bruised but completely outclassed. Found out later that he was quite the amateur boxer when younger. Not sure it counts as a meltdown, but I learned a lot from it and it definitely was outside the norm. It started as a normal lesson with the teacher giving the class a lecture. Then his phone rang, which happens really rarely, but instead of hanging up like he would usually do, he answered. When he hung up, he had the most distraught face I've ever seen and stayed silent for close to a minute. I'm sorry, a friend just committed suicide, he said before sobbing quietly and excusing himself out of the classroom. Edit. Wow, there's so many sad stories going down there. I'm so sorry for all the losses teachers have experienced. After our class picture, our first year teacher declared new rule. Every day is now class picture day. I want to see smiles from each and every one of you every single day. The class let out a collective groan, and the teacher said, come on, turn those frowns upside down. She kept at us for a good month on the smile policy. Keep in mind, this was during the 90s. The class was divided evenly amongst goths, grunge and gangsters. The only thing we agreed upon were that smiles were for pussies. The meltdown came the day she brought in her karaoke machine and attempted to sing Tim McGraw's Just to See You Smile. We just sat there stone-faced as usual. Then she tried to ham it up just to get us to laugh, but nothing. We were all too tough to show any humor or heart. And then she broke down and started blubbering. I just wanted a smile. Is that too much to ask? Apparently it was, because none of us even had the goddamn common courtesy to offer her a tissue. Next day, she went resting beach face on our asses, and word on the street is she hasn't cracked a smile in 20 years. I know I'm dating myself, but here goes. When I was a senior at the Air Force Academy in 1980, my policy professor was a young hotshot captain in the AF who had graduated from the academy sometime earlier. He was very smart and liked to crack wise with us cadets because he was still young enough to relate to us age-wise. He was also one of the most together people I've ever met. Never lost his cool. One day in April of 1980 he came into the lecture hall. We could all tell there was something wrong because he wasn't his normal enthusiastic, jovial self. He stood at the lectern in silence for a few minutes and then started talking, not about the lesson, but about what had transpired in Iran 48 hours before. It was called Operation Eagle Claw, and President Carter had ordered the armed forces to go in and rescue the American hostages held by the Iranian militant students. The short story is the operation was a dismal failure and lives were lost. The pertinent part is that American soldiers, including one of the rescue team members that was in one of the aircraft that blew up, lost their lives. My instructor related to us how the aircrew member had been his roommate at the academy and best man in his wedding. He stolidly told the circumstances of the botched rescue, but the part that finally hit home was when he described what the Iranians did to the bodies of the fallen soldiers after the mission failed. When he talked about how they had dragged the burned bodies through the streets of Tehran, strung them up on a bridge for all to see, and then poked holes in them with bayonets, and generally mutilated them. That's where he had to stop. He had no voice left, and had to turn from us, so we would not see him weeping. All of us were choked up as well, seeing this guy reveal his humanity. Like a boss though, he turned back to us, wiped away tears and resumed class, taught the lesson, and did not break down again. Gets to me even now thinking about that. BTW. Sorry for the TL. Doctor History lesson.